Hey everyone, how's it going? Can you all see me? And can you all hear me? I'm very excited to see everyone here. And just a heads up, there's going to be a little bit of a delay on my end, but I see in the chat you guys can see me and hear me. Awesome. That is the first step to a successful introducing winter tree identification class. Fantastic. I've seen people that have been saying hello and where they're from. I think that's awesome. Please, if you could, let us know where you're from. Keep doing that. And I'm also very interested to hear why are you here today? What has got you interested in winter tree identification? Awesome. Someone from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio. I saw some people from Canada. Shout out to my friends in Canada. I'm Canadian as well. Kentucky, Nova Scotia, Manitoba. Very cool. Let's see, refresher. Yep, learning to correctly identify trees. That's the main one. Foraging, nature interest, rudery. What types of trees do you have on your land? Horticulture, okay. Trees for mushrooming, yes, definitely. We'll be talking about that. Arboriculture. Get to know the woods better. Expand knowledge of wild plants, medicinals, and edibles. Yes, fantastic. Awesome. Yeah, so I'll tell you what got me initially interested in winter tree identification. So it's funny because I always thought that trees would be a really challenging thing for me to learn. And when I first started foraging, foraging was the first thing that got me interested in nature. So I looked around at the trees, didn't know leaves very well, and I saw the bark and kind of knew it a little bit, but turns out on the other side of really doing a deep dive on tree ID, it's one of the easiest ones to learn. And it's one of those that, you know, within 2 years, you can really learn like 80% plus of the trees that are on your landscape. So I think that's really cool, and it gives you a lot of confidence when you're walking through the woods or through the fields to understand and know more about your local ecology. Okay, so I think we should go ahead and get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this class is going to work first, and then we are going to dive right on into the presentation and start learning about the fundamentals of winter tree identification. My name is Jesse, and I run this platform called Feral Foraging. So we teach everything relating to foraging and everything surrounding foraging. And tree identification, knowing your trees, whether those are fruit, nut trees for a direct benefit, or just getting a better understanding of your ecology to know what kind of herbaceous plants are going to be around this area, what kind of wild mushrooms might grow around this area, are all things that I'm interested in and that we're going to learn more about today. So, we have a few things. It's going to be a presentation. We also have a camera right over here. So I actually have a buds that I'm going to show you that we're going to look at live while we're doing the class, so you can see them in 3 dimensions and start to get a feeling for the details that we're going to be learning about. I also have these right here. These are some tree identification sheets that I made. They are the cheat sheet that I made for me when I was learning this. I'm going to tell you about how you can use them and how you can get them at the end of this presentation. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the presentation and learning about winter tree identification. Okay, so by the way, this is an introduction. So no matter what level of understanding that you have of plant ID or identification in general, this is going to be starting from the beginning, and we're going to build up from there. So winter tree ID has always sounded like a difficult thing to me, and I think I know why that was. So when I first started learning about trees, you know, here we have a tree and it's got a bunch of leaves on it, and it's got this nice, beautiful bark. And then in the wintertime, the leaves fall, and so what are we left with? We're left with the bark. And identifying trees in the wintertime only by their bark, that is difficult. And I think it's just the most obvious detail there, but there's a hidden one that we're going to learn about in just a second. But I think that bark distracts us. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult is that it changes over the course of the life of a tree. So in all three of these different photos, this is the exact same species of tree, just at different stages of its life. Can anyone tell me what this tree is? It's quite obvious by the shaggy bark that we see on the far right over there. And let's see if anyone recognizes this one. Hickory. Yep. Shagbark hickory. Exactly. So this one is a shagbark hickory. And the one on the left, which doesn't look shaggy at all, is also a shagbark hickory. And with the details that I'm going to tell you about today, you're going to be able to recognize a shagbark hickory, whether or not it's at the later stages of its life where we can see that very distinctive detail for which it gets its name. Okay, I've been teasing it, so this is what the trick is. It is a detail that is extremely distinguishable, and unlike the bark, it does not change over time, and that's the biggest one. And here it is. It's the buds of the tree. Learning this, in my opinion, is the most important thing to learn first when you're getting into winter tree identification. I mean, we have 8 different buds here, and look at each of them. They are so incredibly distinctive. If I were to get you to look at any one of these in detail and then show you a different one, there's no way that you would mistake the two. You would know immediately which one was from all the others. So this is what I call the game of buds. Winter's coming, winter's here, and we need to make sure that we are all ready. So the title of this presentation is called Buds Are Your Buddies, and I really, really think that they are. Here's an overview of the different details that we are going to be learning about. Now, I know that this looks like a lot right now, but don't worry. We're going to go through each one of these, and I'm going to show you not just all the one by one, but I'm going to show you them in a particular order. And the order is going to be what you're going to be using on a typical dichotomous key. Okay. What is a dichotomous key? This, in my opinion, is one of the best tools that you can possibly utilize when you are learning to identify something new, whether that is trees or mushrooms or flowering herbaceous plants or ferns, whatever it might be. And the reason is because we are always given the most important, broadest questions first, and then we narrow down to the more detailed sections later. So for instance, this is a dichotomous key. This one is for vertebrates. And the first question that we're presented with is, does it have fur? That's it, just one question with either yes or no. So if the answer is yes to that, then cool, we have a mammal, and now we're done. We have finished that part of the key. However, if the answer is no, then what happens is we are led to another question. And in this case, the next question is, does it have feathers? Once again, if the answer is yes, great. Okay, we have a bird. If the answer is no, we have another question. Does it have dry skin? And so on and so forth. So we are going to be learning this system, but for trees specifically in the wintertime. Now, where can you get a dichotomous key for trees? One of the best ones would be a field guide. So here's one that I have right here. This is Native Trees of the Southeast. This one is a particularly good book. Another one that I really love are the Peterson Field Guides to Trees. They have really fantastic information, particularly on winter tree IDs, so I would recommend those as well. You can also look them up online, and if you're on our mailing list after this class, I'm going to send out a few of those resources that you can use. If you're not on the mailing list, I'm going to get Laramie in the chat to send a link so that you can sign up and make sure to receive that, as well as all the other notifications that we send out for our classes and different foraging and plant identification resources. Okay, so arrangement. Arrangement is the first detail that we want to start looking for when it comes to winter tree ID. And actually, this one is applicable to both summer or leaf tree ID as well as winter tree ID, and we'll talk about why in just a second. Okay, so these are 3 different types of arrangements that you're going to encounter. I'll go ahead and say for whorl, this one is a relatively rare arrangement. You're not going to come across it very often, and it's where there are multiple leaf nodes that come off the same point. If there's only two that come off the same point, that would be opposite. And if they don't come off at the same point, if they alternate up the twig, then that would be an alternating arrangement. By far, alternating and opposite are going to be the most common. And for opposite, there is a mnemonic that I want you to start to memorize. If you find a tree that has oppositely branched buds, then you've got it made. Made. M-A-D-E, which stands for maple, ash, dogwood, and elder. Those are four of the most common trees that you're going to come across that have an opposite branching arrangement. However, you might also have what I call horse vibes. Horse being horse chestnut or buckeye, also having an opposite arrangement, and vibes for viburnum, which also have an opposite arrangement. So you've got it made, but you may have horse vibes. And that is going to constitute the vast majority of the opposite branched trees and bushes that you might find, particularly in eastern North America. By the way, so a lot of the ones that I'm going to show you are from eastern North America. However, all these details are applicable anywhere that you go in the world where you have deciduous trees that produce leaf buds in the wintertime. Okay, so before we move on, I'm going to switch to the bud cam and we're going to look at some of these. All right, so here is the first one. Now, what you can see is that we have one bud right here, and then we have another one right here, and then another one up here. So they're not coming off of the same point. So this one is alternating. Contrast that with this one right here, where if you look closely, you can see that these two buds are coming off at the same point, right? So this one will be opposite. So we've got it made, and this one is actually the M of made. This is maple. This one in particular is a sugar maple. And if you're interested, after the class, I actually just did a video on how to distinguish the different species of maples, not just this particular one, but all of them. All right, so I'm going to switch back to the presentation, and we'll go one more. So here's just a couple more examples, and on the far left, sometimes you'll call it this is what I call at least, this is a terminal whorl, where you have a cluster of buds at the end of the twig. This is typically reserved for oak species. Oak trees have this characteristic. And then we see another example of alternate. This one is with willow. We have opposite, which we just talked about, and another one that I want to show you, which is called sub-opposite, where they're just nearly exactly at the same point. Sometimes, especially towards the end of a twig, they can look sub-opposite, but if they aren't exactly sub-opposite everywhere that you find it, then that is going to be something that's alternate. So we have to look at the whole tree and multiple examples. And by the way, the bud arrangement is followed by the leaf arrangement. Why? Because the buds are going to lead to leaves. So whatever the bud arrangement is going to lead to the leaf arrangement. Same as the branching arrangement. So in some cases, I'll be out scouting, and you can actually use binoculars and just look up at the tree and see the way that the branches are going. On things like maple trees, you'll see the branches coming off at the same point. Again, being indicative of it being oppositely branched, leafed, and budded. Does that all make sense? I'm going to stop for a second to make sure that everyone is following along with that. Awesome. Great to hear. By the way, there is a super chat setting. If you have a question that you definitely don't want me to miss, because there's a lot that comes in on the chat, that is a great way to make sure that I definitely see that. Okay. Next thing that we're going to do is move on to the next detail. So typically, if you are looking at a dichotomous key in a field guide, the very first one that you're going to encounter is the arrangement. This is the second one that you're going to encounter, and that is the concept of a terminal bud. Okay, so there's a little bit of nuance to this one, but it's relatively simple once you get the hang of it. So we have two types of two instances of terminal buds. We either have a true terminal bud or what's called a false terminal bud. Sometimes you'll see this as having a terminal bud or lacking a terminal bud, just depending on the field guide that you encounter. But what we're looking for mainly is with a true terminal bud, that is going to be exactly at the tip of the twig. And that is where next year's growth is going to resume. It is almost always larger than the buds on the side, and those are called the lateral buds. So if we see a much larger bud exactly at the tip and there's not really a leaf scar next to it, sometimes there will be, that is indicative of there being a true terminal bud. We can see on the presentation here that the true terminal buds are so much larger than the lateral buds that are on the side. And if we contrast that with the ones on the right, particularly for the one that has those fuzzy buds, that would be a slippery elm, we can see that one, they're off at slightly an angle. That's an indication that it's a false terminal bud. The size comparison between the two is almost exactly the same because that bud at the end of the elm that we're looking on there, the fuzzy one, it's just another lateral bud that happens to be at the end of the twig. We can even see that there's a little bit of a continuation of where the twig was going to keep going, and this is just the last one. So same with the true terminal bud, this is where growth is going to resume in the springtime, but it's just another lateral bud. So we would call this having a false terminal bud. And then again, we see that with the mulberry, which is on the far right. And one more tip that I want to give you about trees that have a false terminal bud is you'll often see them with a bit of a zigzag pattern. And if you see twigs that are zigzagging a lot, that is almost always an indication that you are dealing with a tree with a false terminal bud. Here's a few more examples. So on the left, we have a basswood. Again, we see that the bud at the end is kind of off center compared to the rest of the twig. And then the other one, this is a sycamore. Here we can clearly see that that bud at the end is almost exactly the same size as the bud below it and the one below it. So this one is a false terminal bud. One that I want to point out that you're going to run into would be oaks, which we talked about a second ago. And oaks are going to have a cluster at the end. And what I want you to know is that oaks are usually characterized as having a true terminal bud. And the last one, this is sassafras, and we can see how obviously the bud at the end of sassafras is way, way larger, and the ones on the side, the lateral buds, are almost completely minute. We can barely even see them. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second there to tell you about how to utilize that. So those two details right there, the alternate versus opposite arrangement and the true versus false terminal bud, those are the most important details. So if there's only one thing that you take from this class, it would be that. And the reason why I want to pause to tell you a little bit more about that is because that is how I have arranged these tree ID sheets here, which I use. So you can see this is the alternate arrangement false terminal bud. On this page, we have the alternate arrangement true terminal bud. And then, because there aren't quite as many of them, we just have one for the opposite arrangement. But if there was one that I wasn't sure about, then I can use these sheets to see, oh, you know what? I do see that, this one is ending up on the true terminal bud page, and then keep on going there if I was using this alongside with a field guide, or that could give me my ID right there, right away. All right, I'm going to pause one more time to make sure that everyone is on the same page with me about that. Once again, true terminal bud, false terminal bud, and arrangement, those are the most important things. So I want to make sure we don't have any more questions about those before we move on because they're so important. No questions? Yeah, so the term that I'm using there is whirl, like all around. And this is where, this is where with the opposite, we had two coming up the same point, but with a whirl, we have multiple all the way around. Yes, this is true for fruit trees as well. The only other thing that you run into when it comes to fruit trees, excuse me, is you have to identify the buds that are going to be floral buds, which will lead to fruit, versus leaf buds. That is a more advanced topic, so we're not going to be talking about that in this particular class. But the whole thing of identifying trees and going off of the alternate opposite arrangements and then true false terminal buds, those still apply with fruit trees, nut trees, anyone that you're going to come across. Okay. Great. So we are going to keep on moving on. All right. Oh. Spines, prickles, and thorns. So believe it or not, but what I would always just refer to as a thorn, I think I would use the term thorn for every kind of plant that I run across. There's actually a distinction between the three. So on the far left, we have a spine. In the middle, we have a prickle, and then on the right, on the far left, we have a thorn, and on the far right, we have spines. And these are, on the far left is an American plum, in the middle is rose, and on the far right, we have black locust, all of which produce something that can be eaten or gathered by foragers, so I'm particularly interested in that. And I don't want you to worry about the details of which one is which, but I wanted to show you that there is a difference and that does exist. And I'm showing you this detail right now because this is often something that is something of a shortcut when you encounter them on dichotomous keys for winter trees. Sometimes they'll show it really, really early on because if it does have this characteristic, then it's kind of a shortcut to go ahead and very quickly find out what it is, because this is another detail where there aren't so many of these that you'll come across. Yes, and another piece of trivia that I wanted to point out is that we all know the phrase, every rose has its thorn, right? Well, technically, a botanist would turn away from that phrase. The correct thing to say would be that every rose has its prickle. Roses have prickles, they don't have thorns. So, the more you know. All right, and now we're moving back onto details that are more specifically about the buds that we were looking at just a second ago. Okay, there are 4 categories of bud scales that we want to look at. So the first one would be if a bud doesn't have any scales on it at all. And the scales are there to protect the bud in the wintertime. But some trees have different strategies and they won't have any at all. And if they have 0, then that would be called a naked bud. These are very obvious and usually they are very hairy. So in the case of this one, this is a bitternut hickory and it has 0 bud scales or a naked bud. The next one is a 1-scaled bud. There aren't so many of these, but I put up an example here. This is a willow twig with some willow buds on it. And if you were to try to remove the scales there, it would all come apart as one single piece. The next one is called a valvate bud, or valvate bud with valvate bud scales. Again, this one is kind of difficult to find, but this is from a tulip poplar. So if I were to take this apart, then those pieces there would fall apart in 2. So 2 would be valvate. All right, the last one here is probably the most common one they're going to come across. This would be called an imbricate bud or bud scales, and this is just to indicate any bud that has 3 or more scales. We call that imbricate. What you're typically going to run into in a field guide is something like, does it have many bud scales or few, or particularly does it have a naked bud? That is a very obvious giveaway. But you're usually not going to have to count between, okay, does it have 5 or 7? That's not the level of detail that we're looking at. But it may be something like, does it have 3 or many, where there are so many that you can't count them easily. So let's take a quick look at some of these under, there it is, sorry, wrong button. All right, so here is the tulip poplar that I was talking about before. And we can see that there's kind of a line right there. So this is going to be divided into two pieces. So this one is a valvate bud. Here's another one. So we can see this one has actually started to dry, and that's why it's kind of folding apart, which is great for us for this particular exercise because we can see each of those individual bud scales that are coming apart. And we can see how many there are. So if I were to run across this in a field guide, it would probably just say many bud scales, and that's what I would be looking for. And then I wanted to show you one thing because I passed over it. So here is that black locust twig and bud, and we can see that there are the spines right there. Very, very obvious. We would never mistake that if we were out in the field looking for it. All right, last one for those. Here is one of my favorites. This again is the bitter nut hickory, and we are looking at the naked bud in this case. And one way that I could kind of confirm that and tell is if I were to rub the bud on the outside, I would find it to be very hairy to the touch. And if you find something that's very hairy to the touch like that, there's a good chance that it is a naked bud. Okay, want to make sure that everyone is on the same page of that with me, and then we will keep on moving on to one of my favorite details. Witch hazel. I'm trying to think of witch hazel off the top of my head. I would need to go back and confirm that. I can't remember off the top of my head if they have naked buds or not. Okay, I'm going to keep on going on to one of my favorite details to look for. I think that this one is really cool because it kind of starts to give you a pattern for not just the tree and where it is now, but where it was and then where it's going to. Let me take a sip of water really quick. This is my fun Feral Foraging mug for the stream. Shout out to Miss Magnolia's Moxie for getting me that as a gift. It is a great mug. Okay, so now we're looking at the leaf scar and the bundle scars. So the leaf scar is the point on the twig where last year's leaf fell off and it left behind this scar. Now in the leaf where it connects to the twig are a series of what I would essentially call veins that lead into the rest of the plant. Where those veins break off, they leave behind bundle scars. So we have the leaf scar overall, and within the leaf scar are the bundle scars. And the big thing that we are using here is two things. Number one is the size of the leaf scar. And then the second one are the number of bundle scars, or maybe the shape or the characteristics of the bundle scars. So we can see on the far left, we have a leaf scar that is enveloping the bud that's around it, which is different from some of the other ones where the leaf scar is completely below the leaf bud where it is. So the one on the far left is actually an ash species. And I always mix these up. So there's green ash and there's white ash. And I believe it's white ash where the bud is embedded and green ash where the bud is atop. But that is an example of what I would call a definitive distinguishing characteristic. So we have two very close look-alike species when we look at the whole thing broadly. But for every look-alike, there is at least one detail that you can look for that is going to distinguish it from the other one. In this case, that is the detail for ash tree species, whether the leaf scar is around or whether it is below the bud. The next one that we see over with a really, really big kind of beige bud, that is a mockernut hickory. And this one I just think is so cool because the bundle scars are one, very obvious, but two, they come in these clusters. You can see that they kind of go around in a circle. And sometimes you won't see that it has just a particular number of bundle scars, but you'll see that it has a number of groups of bundle scars. So in the case of this mockernut hickory right here, we might see a description where it says it has 3 groups of bundle scars and not just however many are there, 12 perhaps. All right, the next one over is a sweet gum. I think that one is in the next slide as well, which I'll show you in a bit more detail. And then the one over to that is maple once again. And if we look closely, we can see that there's 1, there's 2, and then there's 3 bundle scars. And as far as I know, every maple species has 3 bundle scars. Okay, so here's an even closer look at that same detail. On the left, we have that one that I was talking about before. This is sweet gum. And another really cool thing about sweet gum that we're going to talk about one of the details later, but the first one is that, again, it always has 3 bundle scars. 3 extremely distinct, definitive bundle scars. And then on the right, we have Tree of Heaven, an invasive tree. If you find this, I recommend removing it because it's a non-native, grows invasively, it snaps really easily, not a fun tree to have. But here we see a pattern that's similar to what we saw with the mockernut hickory, where we don't just have a set of bundle scars, but we actually have a set of a group of bundle scars. So we might see a description of something like 7 groups of bundle scars if we were to look at something like this. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the bud cam really quick, and then feel free to put any questions in the chat. But I really want to show this one a little bit closer. So here is that same mockernut hickory that we're talking about before. And then you can see those spots on there. And those spots are the bundle scars. On the leaf scar, the whole thing is the leaf scar of this mockernut hickory. So after this presentation, you are going to be just like me. You're never going to walk down the street the same again. You're never going to walk through the forest the same again. Your friends will wonder if they're hiking or wandering because you're just going to go from tree to tree and looking like, oh, what about this one? Oh, what about this one? Oh, what about this one? But it's so much fun. Once you learn these details and you learn the exact things that you need to look for, you start to learn very quickly because it's like, oh, okay, well, I know that this one can't be that other one that I thought it was because this one has 3 and that other one had 6. And in my field guide says that this one always has 3. So it gives you a lot of information of where and what you need to look for. Yeah. For everyone who is hearing this information and they're just thinking like, man, I can't wait to go outside. I can't wait to explore and put this information to the test. Let us know. Let us know in the chat that you are interested in doing that, and maybe like what tree you want to go look for to see how many of the bundle scars does this tree have that I'm thinking of. Okay, here we have another one that I think is very much overlooked, but is one of the coolest details to start to look for. And that's the pith. Okay, so we're looking at these. I'm going to talk about these different types of tree piths. I guess I could say piths in a second. But we have to first talk about what a twig is from a technical perspective. Because if I were to try to look for the pith in the wrong place, then I wouldn't find the right information. So in the United States and English-speaking countries, we use the term twig kind of flippantly to refer to any small piece of a tree. But when we're talking about identification, we need to be more specific. So a twig is the part of a tree's growth that is from just the previous year's growth, right? So this right here, I'll put it back on the bud cam. So these are twigs, right? These are just from the first year's growth. If we're talking about the second to third year's growth, that would be called a branchlet, and then the third year's growth and later, that is a whole branch. So when we are looking for the pith, we need to make sure that we have the actual twig, the first year's growth, because later on it's all going to be, relatively speaking, it's all going to be very woody. But at the youngest growth of the first year, the pith will be very distinctive and have these different characteristics that we can start to look for. So on the far left, we have a solid or continuous pith. And this is what I would imagine that basically all trees would have in them, is that it's just generally woody. And one thing that we can look for is that there might be some difference in color on the very core inner part versus the outer part, but it's generally speaking solid all the way through. If you were to take your nail and poke into it, it would be very difficult. The next one over, that is also a very, very common one, would be what I think of when I hear the word pith. I think of like something that's spongy, pithy, spongy. So it's spongy or porous. So in this case, there's going to be an outer part, which will be woody, and then the inner part, which will be distinctly softer. So if I were to take my nail and press into it, it would press in much, much easier. I think that this is an ash that we're looking at, which has the characteristic. The next one over is one of the cooler ones, I think. And that is a diaphragmed pith. Diaphragmed. It is very similar to the one next to it, which is a chambered pith. They both have chambers. However, in between the chambers of a diaphragmed pith is a spongy portion. In between the chambers of a chambered pith is nothing. There's nothing in between. The two trees that classically exhibit this characteristic, a chambered pith, would be black walnut and butternut. Those are both closely related, black walnut and butternut. And then the last one that we might run into is hollow, where we cut the pith and it's completely hollow on the inside. It's not spongy, there's no chambers, it's just completely hollow. This one is a honeysuckle that has that characteristic. Honeysuckle is another one of the trees that go ahead and get rid of it. It's extremely invasive. I think it's even more invasive than privet. And yeah, it takes over very fast. So I'm always on the lookout for removing honeysuckle from wherever I go, or from foraging it as much as I possibly can, because if I forage the flowers, then it can't reproduce, and then I'm stopping it from spreading quite as much. Okay, I'm going to check the questions here really quick. So one question is, does this information include sumacs? And yes, this certainly applies to sumac. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of what the inside of sumac looks like. And my guess is that it's spongy pith, but I would have to double check to be certain. And for those of you that don't know what sumac is, this is you might know it from the spices at your grocery store, same species. Not to be confused with poison sumac, so the true sumacs are in the Rhus genus. Poison sumac, completely different genus, different plant, doesn't have the red cluster of berries that point up. Poison sumac is different. And yeah, I'm not exactly certain. And then a really good question, how do you tell a first year twig from a second year twig, or from second year growth, and so on? That's great. So the first one that's easiest is if it's at the very, very end of a branch, you're getting off the newest part, that's almost certainly the twig. But there's another detail that we can look for, which I'm going to show you later on in the presentation. And it's really, really cool. You'll see. Okay. The next one is kind of related to one that we talked about earlier, and that is the bud or twig having hair, or being hairy, or lack thereof. Oh, but we'll talk about this just a second, but I do want to show you a couple of examples of pith before we do that. And really the one that I want to show you is one of the cooler ones, which is, okay, so you can see that there's kind of these rivets that go across right here. And this is the pith type that's called diaphragmed. So this is a diaphragm pith. This one is what we were looking at earlier, a tulip poplar, and it has a diaphragm pith. And let me see. Yeah, right here. Here's another one. This is the continuous, so I'm going to use kind of poker and try to poke into it, and I'm not really able to. It's very hard and stiff overall. So that's a continuous pith. Contrast that one right here, and if I were to poke into it, you can see that it inserts. So it's very soft right there on the inside. So this one is a spongy pith. Yeah, soft pith typically means spongy. Yes, I'll try to say the names of the twigs that I'm showing more. So we just looked at their tulip poplar, Liriodendron tulipifera, one of my favorite scientific names. And then we looked at a buckeye, Aesculus, I think is the scientific name of that one. And then we also looked at a hickory right there. Hickory had the solid pith, tulip poplar had the diaphragmed pith, and the buckeye had the soft or spongy pith. All right, so bud hairiness. We talked before that a naked bud is typically hairy, and that is true in these cases, although for the one on the far left, this is box elder, Acer negunda, which is technically a maple, which has these really, really beautiful, vibrant green twigs. Sometimes they're a little bit purple too. And it does, I think typically you will see them saying that it has bud scales. You can kind of see that arrangement right there. But they're very, very distinctly hairy, contrasted with a very, very smooth twig. So it's a really obvious one from that standpoint. Next over to it, we have one from Carolina buckthorn. This one has both, you can see, hairy buds. These ones are definitely called naked buds, no bud scales, and also a distinctly hairy twig as well. And then we go one over, and we have two. We would call these glabrous or smooth. So the one closest, not at the far right, is black cherry. And the black cherry has a very shiny one, and then even shinier is the one on the far right. And you might recognize this one from before because it has those three very distinct bundle scars in the leaf scar. This one is sweet gum again. Sweet gum has just a very, very shiny buds. It's one of the most obvious trees to identify by its buds. Let me show you a couple of those really quick. So here's one, and it might, I'm not sure how well it'll come across, but this is one of my favorites. You can see that it kind of has this rough outer part on the twig, and it has these dark triangular buds right there. And then another one, I'll show it to you. Let's see, I'm actually going to show it to you on my guide because I think that it has maybe a closer view. Can we see it? Yeah, so it's persimmon. And what I wanted to show you is this point right here. One of the cool things about persimmon is that it has a single bundle scar, which is kind of a crescent shape, almost like a smile. But it has a very hairy twig. So that's one thing that I want to show you. By the way, if you're in the chat and you've foraged for persimmon before, please let me know. Let everyone know. I'm curious to see if people here have foraged for persimmon. It's one of my favorite fruits. Okay. I think that I have... Yeah. And then once again, we have the bitternut hickory right here with hairy bud. Okay. Here's another example of the use of a distinguishing characteristic with hairiness. So on the left, we have slippery elm, which typically has very rough, fuzzy twigs and rough, fuzzy buds. And then we can contrast that with American elm, which typically has maybe a few hairs here and there, but it's overall smooth on the twig and it's overall smooth on the buds as well. So that is a use of that characteristic as a distinguishing detail. Okay, See people talking about foraging for persimmons, and then people foraging for pawpaws. So a note on pawpaws, I do have a video about this as well, because we're just talking about bud hairiness. Pawpaws also have naked buds. At least Asimina triloba, the main one that people look for, has naked buds. So if you look for it, it's kind of like a chocolate brown color, very hairy, and it's very, very obvious. Pawpaws have very obvious buds. It's one of those where it is far easier to find and spot pawpaw by their buds than it is by any other characteristic, in my opinion. In the wintertime is a great time to go out looking and scouting for pawpaws because, you know, what else are you going to do? If it's snowing or if there's just not much else to forage for, might as well scout for next year's fruit so you can get more next year. That's one of the reasons why I think winter tree identification is so great. Okay, here's a smaller detail that I think is really, really cool. Another one that is overlooked. And this is stipule scars. So a stipule in the summertime is kind of a leafy structure that grows around or in parts of the leaf node. And they come in a couple of different forms. So the first one on the very far left, this is a stipule scar that wraps around the entire twig. So it goes completely around. The same one on the far right, or at least it goes nearly around the whole twig. So the far left, we have tulip poplar, which we've looked at several times because it has so many interesting characteristics. And the one on the right is the sycamore. In the middle, we have a really cool kind of, I guess you'd call it more of a bush or a shrub. This is American bladdernut. And it has stipule scars that are kind of little notches right there. So they're not ever going to go all the way around, but they're just going to be little notches on the sides. Let me show you those on the buds that we have. Great, we have a go-to example right here. So you can already see them. See these rings that are going around, and they're at each of the leaf nodes right there, like that. Once again, this is tulip poplar, and that is a stipule scar. So there was a kind of like a leafy growth that was going all the way around the twig last year, and when it fell off, it left behind this scar. That's a really, really good one to look for. Okay, let's see. I think that we have 2 or 3 details left, but before I get to those, I did want to take a second to tell you a little bit more about these guides. So I will say these are going to be helpful to you, particularly if you are in Eastern North America. That is what the species complex is on these here. So if you are in Eastern North America, I think that these will be very helpful for you because I've taken those most important characteristics that we talked about earlier on and I organized them in that fashion so that when you're going through the woods, you can use these details that you just learned and see, okay, this one has a true terminal bud and this one is alternating. So I need to look on this sheet right here. And it's kind of a pared down version to only show you the most common trees. So I like to think of this as a cheat sheet or a shortcut. Some cases you don't want to go all the way through all the dichotomous keys all the way over again. So you can use this guide and they're laminated and very lightweight. So you can take them with you in the woods, throw them in a backpack. They can take all kinds of abuse and use them to accelerate your journey of winter tree identification. And if you are interested in purchasing those, you can use the QR code right here, which is going to take you to the Feral Foraging website where you can get one. You can also check out the link that Laramie is about to send in the chat to purchase one as well. So if you're getting a lot out of this class and you're really enjoying it and you'd like to give back, this is a really great way that you are supporting us and the education work that we do, and you get a great product out of it yourself. So I just wanted to plug that really quick in case you are interested, because I do think that it'll be very helpful to you. I'll show you really quick on the bud cam. I did all the photography was by me. We used a macro lens, so it really does try to highlight the most important characteristics and details that you will find in all of these. And it also presents to you, you'll see bud color, scales, and arrangement. It's going to show you all those details that we have been learning about and talking about in this class here today. So it's designed for this way of learning. All right. Let's see, any questions about that? Or the field guides? The field guides, the Peterson field guide is fantastic. And then if you are in the Southeast in particular, this is another good book, Native Trees of the Southeast is a really good field guide. But yeah, Peterson Field Guide just has really great winter tree ID characteristics. I'm sure for anywhere in the country that they've done their books, they're good as well. But the one that I'm familiar with is the one from Eastern North America. Okay, moving on to the last couple of details. Unfortunately, I don't have a tree bud guide for Western North America. I need to take a trip over there in the wintertime or something, or work with a photographer in that area so that I can get more sets of these winter tree bud guides for other parts of the world. I really hope that I get to do that sometime soon. Okay, so this next detail, this is going to help out with that question that we got earlier, which is how do we know what year of growth the particular tree or the particular part of the tree that we have is from? And a really great way to look at that is with what's called a bud scale scar. Bud scale scar. Okay, so what is a bud scale scar? On the right, again, we have our great bud model. This is sweet gum. And then on the left, we have beech tree, American beech. And the bud scale scar is going to look kind of like a cluster of scars that are really, really close, really compressed close to each other. And what that is a representation of is where the tree's growth continued on through the portion that had bud scales, and those fell apart and left scars behind. So this can happen with both a false terminal bud like this beech tree, but it mainly happens with trees that have a true terminal bud like the one on the right. Again, this is sweet gum. And what we can do is, because every time that we have a bud scale scar, that represents usually a point that we had a true terminal bud or the end bud, and where it grew through that. So that is one season's growth. So we can use that to get a general idea of the age of the twig and the portion of the twig that we are looking for. That is a really, really great detail to go by. I think it's also just a really cool one. Like, you can see how distinctive they are on the beech tree, and it also gives you an idea of the speed at which this tree ages. Of course, this could be on a part of a lateral growth of the tree where it's not growing quite so much each year, and maybe if we got one from further up in the tree, it would be growing in a faster fashion, but it gives us an idea of how much the tree grew in each season. It's kind of like, does everyone know about that detail with white pine, where, white pine has a whorl pattern, a whorl branching. So the trunk goes up, and then there's a set of branches that go out all in every direction, and then a bit more, and then a bit more. And in a year where growing conditions were good, you'll see a large gap between those two whorls. In a year where the growing conditions weren't quite as good, it wouldn't have grown as much, and so the gap will be smaller. There's a great book called, I think, Forest Forensics, or if you just look up forest forensics online, there's some really, really cool details that you can start to learn that are going to just open up a whole new world of stories and history that you can read in the forest, in the landscape. I think it's really cool. All right, we are on to the very last detail of the presentation, and this is a leaf bud versus a floral bud. So I'm going to give a kind of a brief overview, just particularly for the ones where it's very, very obvious. This is something that's important if you have a fruit orchard and you need to know what parts of the growth or what parts of the tree have buds that are going to lead to floral and fruit growth later on, and what parts are just leafy or vegetative growth. So one of the most obvious examples is this one, where on the right, I think, is the more iconic form of this tree. This is another representative of the maple, ash, dogwood, elder. You've got it made. This one is actually dogwood. We can see right here that this is, where's my, I didn't show the laser. That's where it's coming off at the same point. So the branching is opposite, which means that the bud arrangement and the leaf arrangement is opposite as well. And on the right, we have the floral growth, and we can see that it's very large and obvious. And this is going to lead to, on a flowering dogwood, this really pretty white flowers that we see in the springtime. And then the one on the left, much tinier, looks a lot more like what we envision with a leaf bud. This one is for vegetative growth. So it's not going to yield a flower, it's just going to be a leaf, or perhaps continue on of extending that twig further along. Okay, so that was I got another question that came in with the bud scale. Oh, okay. So the question was, would the bud scale scars equate with the rings in the trunk and the branches and so on? And the answer is kind of. So it is similar to that fashion, where it's kind of a metric that we can use to gauge the age of a particular part of the tree. However, as the tree ages, it's quickly going to go away and we won't really be able to see them anymore. Let me switch back to the bud cam one more time, because that brings up a good point, to show you one more detail that we didn't get a chance to cover. We'll stick with the tulip poplar. It's done well for us so far. Okay, and I want to point out these tiny little spots. Does everyone see those tiny little spots on the tulip poplar? So what these tiny spots are what are called lenticels. So they are a portion of the twig that is responsible for effectively allowing the tree to breathe. It's for oxygen exchange. And most twigs that you'll find have these lenticels. In some cases, they are more numerous than others. And then in some cases, the lenticels are still visible when the tree is older. So if everyone can envision for me if everyone can envision for me a cherry tree, if you can think of a cherry, you might be thinking of those very distinct kind of horizontal scars that you see all over the bark of the tree. So cherry trees in particular are one that keep their lenticels for a long period of time. They're visible for a long period of time. And what those were is they started off as those tiny dots that were on the twigs, and as the tree aged and expanded and grew out, those tiny spots stretched. Sometimes when they stretch, they are horizontal. Other times when they stretch, they're more like diamonds. For instance, with a pawpaw tree, they'll be more like a diamond. With cherry trees, they'll be more horizontal. But those are just the lenticels that we can see on the twigs that stretched as the tree grew and expanded. Okay, I'm checking out the chat to see if there are any other questions there. But leaf buds versus floral buds, that is the last detail that I had for this presentation. So again, just to go over what we accomplished here, we went through a set of a bunch of different details. And what my hope is for you is that when you pick up a book like this, or if you get our guide, this one right here, that you will know what to look for when you're going through the dichotomous key and it's telling you, does this one have a true bud or a true terminal bud or a false? Does this tree have an imbricate bud scales? Is it naked? That you're going to know, I know what that is and I know what to look for, and you will be able to identify that tree. An exercise and some homework that I would give to all of you is to go out and find a bud, any bud that's in your local area, and then if you sign up for our mailing list, or if you have any of these books or get this guide, then you're going to be able to pull up a dichotomous key, and I just want you to go through that key and see how far that you can get and how many details that you already know just from doing this class right here. I think that it may be more than you might imagine. So I'm going to stick around for a little bit longer to answer some questions, but I want to say to all of you, thank you so much for being here. It's great to have all these fantastic questions and an engaged audience to get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, identifying trees in the wintertime. If you want to support us, then a really great way would be to get one of these guides right here, and we will be getting those. That closes in 12 days, By the way, if you're in Huntsville and you're taking my in-person class in about 2 or 3 weeks, these are provided for free. So if you're in that class, then don't worry about buying these because you're going to get one for free. But once again, thank you all so much. This has been really great. If you have any more questions, like I said, I'm going to stick around for just a little bit longer to answer those. But I hope that you have a good night, and I hope that you all be feral and keep on foraging and keep on learning. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you all. Yep, I appreciate these chats coming in. Thanks so much for being here. Oh yeah, and by the way, some people said that they might have to watch this more than one time. That is totally great because this presentation is going to be recorded, so you will definitely have the opportunity to get to go through and watch this more times than once. And next time, if you don't have a bud with you right now, go grab a bud and then watch this one again, and you can go through the details and look at what you have and how they relate to all the ones that we're teaching about. That's right. Valvate is 2 scales, imbricate is 3 or more. There wasn't a fancy botanical term that I know for a single scale. For no scales, that is called a naked bud. Yeah, and for anyone who's interested, I am teaching an in-person full workshop on this information in North Alabama. If you know the Land Trust of North Alabama, you can go to their website and find more information about that. That is a whole weekend long, and that comprises parts of this presentation plus a lot of other stuff. We get into the bark. We actually go out in the field. We collect a bunch of different buds. We have buds that we bring in to show you all kinds of different ones that are commonly found in this area. And then we get to go through them one by one and learn the species that we find around us. Great. Yeah, whenever I go to a new place now, it's like, when I was a kid, if I went to North Carolina from Alabama, it's just, going to the mountains. It wasn't a big detail. But now when I go to North Carolina, I'm like, oh my gosh, this place is completely different. There's all these new species that are out here. The land is just, the ecology is different. And this stuff is just, it's exciting. No matter where you go in the world, you can use these details, and it just makes being outside, it brings you outside because it's that interesting and you want to learn more about it. Very welcome, Jordan. Very welcome. Yeah. Happy to get to bring this information to as many people as possible. No, not Huntsville, Ontario. But it's funny because my family actually has some land around there. So I've visited Huntsville, Ontario several times. It's always funny going from Huntsville all the way to Huntsville. All right. Well, thank you all again so much. Oh, and by the way, if you're watching the recording, you're probably going to be watching the recording now if you're seeing this. If you're watching the recording, we have a lot of information about all of these details that we talked about and about winter tree in general, whether it's for whatever tree that you might find, or particularly for trees that you might want to forage for, whether they're fruit or nut trees, or learning about the ecology, like particular gourmet mushrooms that you might find in the wild. So if you go on our website, feralforaging.com, you can find articles related to that. You can also find videos on our YouTube page, and you can find photos and a bunch of information on our social media, which you can find in the description of this video. So thank you again so much for watching. If you liked the video, that would be a huge help. And we hope to see you in the next one to learn more about winter tree identification and all the things that it can do for you.